Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jessica Van Meer. I'm a barrister at Two Temple Gardens and obviously a member of Gray's Inn. I'm also a member of the Gray's Inn Barristers Committee. And this evening, I have the pleasure of hosting our webinar aimed at practice development with a focus on junior barristers. And joining me today, I have Petra from the marketing director at Three Verulin Buildings. Now, before I introduce Petra, just a couple of housekeeping matters. Firstly, if you have any questions that might come up throughout the conversation that Petra and I will be having this evening, please make sure to use the Q&A feature just at the bottom of your screen rather than the general chat feature to put your questions in. And what we'll do is at the end of the session or nearing the end of the session, I'll go through the questions and pick out various questions that we haven't touched upon during our conversation. And hoover those up and ask them to Petra. So please type those in the Q&A box. And then what I'll do now is I will introduce our guests today. So thank you very well. Just bear with me 1 second. Petra joins us today from Three Verulin Buildings, where she's the marketing director, and she provides business support to Chambers and its members there. By way of background, before going to Three Verulin Buildings in January of 2020, right at the high point of the pandemic, Petra spent nearly 10 years at Essex Courts Chambers, laterally there as the head of their marketing. So Petra has over 15 years of experience working with chambers and developing their business development and their marketing. She holds professional credentials from the Chartered Institute of Marketing, and she's a member of the Legal Practice Managers Association. Thank you so much, Petra, for joining us tonight and for being able to share your wisdom and experience with us. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is, Petra, would you like to explain a bit about why we've decided to hold this event this evening and what your ambition is for the webinar that we're giving?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the very kind introduction, Jessica. Good afternoon, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what we hope will be a useful summary of practical tips for enhancing your personal business development skills. I'm very honoured to have been asked by Gray's Inn to give this talk with Jessica today, and over the next 30 minutes or so, Jessica and I intend to cover some basic aspects of business development at the bar and tell you a little bit about some relatively simple steps you can take to help boost your own profile within the market. I think we were interested in delivering this session because we understand there may be a perceived lack of support or direction when it comes to business development for individuals at the bar. I should probably mention at this point that I'm rather more used to being on the opposite end of webinars such as these and critiquing members giving talks. So I may well be told after this that I should practice what I preach. It's always much easier to give other people direction than to follow your own advice. What I should also say from the outset is that I'm approaching this very much from a marketer's perspective, not that of a senior clerk or a practice manager. They'll be better qualified to advise you in depth about shaping and managing your practice and allocation of work, etc. Although, of course, marketing and business development initiatives should always be considered alongside and as a part of your practice development reviews with your clerks. In some respects, dedicated marketing teams are still relatively new to some sets of chambers. And I think it's beneficial to have that additional resource to focus on what's going on in the market, making sure opportunities are capitalised on and knowing how to best enhance the overall profile of the set and its specialisms.
Now, one of the things that a lot of junior barristers ask, particularly once you're entering your tenancy, having just completed pupillage, is why does business development matter to me? Because you know, I'm part of a chamber. Surely the chamber should be taking care of that for me. So why does business development for each of us individually as a barrister matter?
Well, yes, personal business development is Really, really important. Of course, I'd say that. Most barristers don't do enough BD. I think, people watching the session this evening will all have different cultures in their own chambers in relation to marketing practices, and various structures in place at an organisational level, depending on what procedures your particular set adheres to. And whilst you should absolutely use the resources that are available to you within your set, you shouldn't rely solely on that. I think, the most salient point here is perhaps that doing nothing yourself isn't really an option. You should always be thinking about opportunities. Your clerks, your marketing staff can help to facilitate those opportunities, but you shouldn't necessarily wait for those to arise. You should be actively looking for them to complement whatever practices are already happening in chambers. As a member of a set, you're practicing under the umbrella of the Chambers brand, but business development on an individual level really matters because it shapes the process by which your own practice and your own brand is grown. So broadly speaking, that means developing your practice in terms of earnings, client relationships, cases, and your reputation. I understand, we always have to bear in mind expectations versus limitations. Business development isn't one size fits all, and much of how your plans and intentions in terms of marketing play out is of course dependent on how busy you are. However, effective BD should be undertaken continuously, not just during the quieter periods, and it should really become habitual.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is that it's something that you should be doing all the time, and it's also something that you're never too young to start. So let's talk about that for a moment, because I get also the impression, I'm a bit older in terms of my practice, so I'm probably about a seven-year tenant, and reflecting on business development within my chambers and what I've engaged with myself, I think we can talk about, well, I recognize that you have completely different strategies at different points in your career. So we have a lot of junior tenants, I assume, on this webinar today. And one of the things I'd like to ask you is, could you speak about business development as it changes throughout your career? So for instance, if you've just been taken on and you're in your first few years of tenancy, what would you recommend doing? And what are the habits that you think you should be getting into at that stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I've broken down some marketing best practice advice, first of all, by levels of seniority. So I'll start with some advice for juniors in their first 5 years of practice. And you're absolutely right, Jessica, you're never too young to start. It's so important to get into good BD habits in your early years at the bar. Be proactive as much as possible, because this is the phase where you're making first impressions, considering the shape your practice might take, raising your profile and expanding your professional network. I have got some suggestions for marketing activities you should consider in order to raise your profile, and they are, first and foremost, learn how to make a BD plan. I'm going to talk a lot about planning in this session, but this could be an annual plan and include short-term, medium-term and long-term objectives. It's a good idea to make it realistic and within the confines of the time you have available. Set some targets for yourself. There's much to be said for advanced planning. It will allow you to have a greater focus and to review your BD activities and see what actually works for you. You should join Chambers practice groups. It's likely that there'll be a variety of these for different practice areas you have in your chambers. Make sure you're a part of the ones you're interested in, or indeed all of them to begin with. And importantly, make sure you're on the appropriate internal email distribution lists for those groups. You should attend Chambers events as much as possible. It's really crucial that your members of Chambers get to know you and vice versa, because undoubtedly this creates the most opportunities in your early years of practice, and it's an obvious platform for building relationships and future opportunities in working with more senior members and silks. Think about speaking at chamber seminars or webinars as we now have. Put yourself forward, take advantage of opportunities that may arise to speak with more senior members. You should also think about attending events or conferences run by specialist bar associations such as ComBar or the Chancery Bar Association, or indeed by your inn. I think there are 24 specialist bar associations dedicated to the interests of groups of barristers within those specific practice areas. They're designed to promote their members' interests and to offer support to their members through various networking events and mentoring schemes. Also, really importantly, attend law firm events. So this could be a talk or a social event organised between a specific law firm and a group of members of chambers, perhaps, and it could even be an event focused towards a particular area of practice. It may well present an opportunity to speak alongside a senior junior or a silk. So I think essentially seek out events which will raise your profile. There'll be all sorts of things going on at various different levels. So make sure you educate yourself as to what's going on and forward plan. Also, take up opportunities to write articles, to contribute to publications. This could be a case law update or a practice note, possibly for your chamber's website or through a specific approach from an industry publication like Practical Law or LexisNexis. The next point I'm going to make is one of the most important points. Keep your CV up to date. Yeah. It's really vital. Most people have an online presence now, and your CV on the website will often be the first port of call for a solicitor. So make sure your profile's up to date, and that includes all the details of the latest matters you've been involved in where possible. Think about asking more senior members if you can go along to a coffee or a lunch that they might have planned with a solicitor contact. You have to strike a balance here and gauge when it's appropriate to do this, but it's something to bear in mind that senior juniors and silks in chambers are likely to have established relationships with individuals at law firms already, and what we want to do is to try and tap into those relationships so that eventually they filter down to the junior end over the years. It may be that the more senior member can suggest to the person they're meeting that they bring an associate from their firm along to the meeting too. And following on from that, you should aim for the right people to do BD with. There's not much point juniors below senior junior approaching partners that they haven't worked with previously in the hope of being instructed. More often than not, the partners let their team choose the juniors on their cases, so efforts would be much better directed at the associates. More planning. Think about setting yourself a target to make a certain number of new solicitor contacts over, say, a 6 or 12-month period. Keep a record of the ones that you've made contact with. So this should tie in with the BD plan you make, which I mentioned earlier. Also, talk to the clerks about opportunities for secondments. Your chambers may have a policy for junior tenants to take up placements at law firms or other industry institutions. Secondments are very good BD tools with potentially very rewarding outcomes and a great way of building lasting ties with a firm. And lastly, don't be afraid to ask for feedback. This is such an important part of your personal development, and it shows people that you're self-aware. You place importance on the quality of the work that you're providing, and that work meets the expectations of those that you're working for. So it could be feedback from your leader or from an instructing solicitor on what you've done well or where you could have improved. And if you don't feel comfortable asking the solicitor for feedback directly, then ask your clerks to do it for you.
Just two questions in terms of what you've specifically talked about now. The first one is about that BD plan that you told us about. Yeah, targets. What kind of targets should we be looking at in our BD plan? So one of them that you've already identified is give yourself a number of new solicitor contacts, but what are examples of some other targets that you would say?
Contacts, yeah, absolutely. Think about areas where you may be in a position to give a talk, to write a publication, and put those things down in terms of making a plan. You want to write a certain amount of articles or practice notes in the next 12 months. You have a target to speak at a certain amount of events. You want to have a certain amount of practice meetings with your clerks, for example. Talk to them about certain opportunities, and it's best if these things can be written down and ticked off, and then, as I said earlier, you can see what works best for you.
Yeah. And one other question, that CV that you have to keep up to date. Yeah. What do you think is a healthy refresher rate for that?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint really, but I think people need to always be mindful of keeping it up to date. So if you've worked on a recent matter and it can go on your CV, then make sure that it does, because when we're coming to, not just about it's instructing solicitors looking, but also researchers from the directories will be looking. So if you get to a stage where you're making directory submissions and you're putting down cases there that you think are really significant, but the researcher goes onto the website and sees that it's not on your CV, that they may not understand the significance of it, and they'll think, well, it's probably not that important then. So it's just, a case of constantly thinking about, the wheel really. And obviously, when you start to get into the directories and you start to get quotes, they need to be included on there. But anything that you've done, secondments should be on there, really. And it's just about having that, that foresight to think that needs to be on my CV.
Yeah, so setting yourself, let's say, a monthly reminder or something like that to just look over your CV, make sure that
good idea. I mean, especially in the early years, later on, it monthly, might be a little bit of a tall order, but as much as possible, and just, just trying to keep it in mind, really.
Now, speaking about later on, because you've just told us about what your tips are for those under 5 years call. How do you think business development changes as you become more advanced in your career? So let's say we're talking now 5 to 10 years call.
Yeah, well, a lot of the same principles that I've just covered will still apply in the next stages of your career as you move up in seniority. It's just as important to keep these things in mind as you progress your practice. And by now, you'll hopefully be super efficient at making BD plans. But at this stage, you should start to see an increase in named work and perhaps a move into increased specialisms. You should definitely be thinking about increasing your visibility at this point. So, as I said, you should be making BD plans that potentially include identifying target firms now and target individuals at those firms. Perhaps do some analysis with your clerks about the types of cases you're seeing or that you've seen over the years and where your work has been coming from. Can you spot any trends, for example? That's always useful to know. And I think at this point, as you become busier, there's also a risk of losing touch with people that you may have worked with previously. You should never underestimate the benefit of contacting a solicitor you've worked with before. You might not be currently instructed on a matter with them, but even if it's just to see how they're doing, reach out, reconnect. This sort of communication is hugely appreciated by people. Often, solicitors, they don't have the time to stay in touch with people. If you don't make the effort, inevitably you'll lose touch. And it could be as simple as dropping them an email or a quick message through LinkedIn. I think, again, aim for the right activity with the right people. Solicitors don't always want to be taken out for expensive lunches. In fact, some of them expressly don't want that. I'd say on the whole, my experience is that associates quite like a lunch or dinner as they don't do so much marketing. So to them, it's potentially novel and interesting. On the other hand, partners tend to do much more marketing with their own clients, which means that taking hours out for a lunch might be a bit difficult. Some people prefer to go out for a coffee. That doesn't disrupt too much of the working day. Others prefer drink after work, which still allows them to focus on work during the day and then to get home and have some of the evening with their family. But the most important point is always check. Marketing works best doing something that people feel they have the time for. And of course, different people will have different preferences. We're talking about all this, and obviously there'll be an element of easing back into these types of activities after the various lockdowns we've lived through. You'll find, I think, that you've got people who are really hungry for personal contact, and I think really there's no substitute for spending time building relationships face to face again and breaking down those boundaries. And I think, in this sort of stage, in the 5 to 10 year stage, you should be a little bit more discerning about your target audience. Again, getting the right content to the right people is vital, giving people what they're interested in and what will be useful to them rather than blanket or indirect communications. So think about personalization and direct marketing. So for example, if you've written something that relates to a specific area of law, make sure the people you're putting it in front of practice in that area or have an interest in it. Again, plan and record your marketing activities somewhere. So if you're having coffee or lunch or whatever with a solicitor, then tell your clerks, tell your marketing team about it, keep a record. And you probably want to be thinking about starting to measure your success at this stage. So are you meeting those targets that you've set yourself previously? How much BD have you undertaken? Are you seeing a rise in the number of cases, the number of instructions that come your way, income year on year, things like that?
Now, we need to talk about the pandemic, right? Because some of the suggestions that you've just given are not open to us yet, right? Like we can't take a solicitor out for lunch, coffee, breakfast, or drinks yet. It's coming. So the question that I have now is in terms of, I mean, all of our lives have been changed quite dramatically in the last year, and it's obvious that the legal market has been impacted by that as well. What do you think barristers need to do to pivot and to take into account the change that's happening with, you know, things, webinars, for instance, now happening virtually rather than in person?
Yeah, of course. And I think, you know, absolutely right. The way in which we communicate has totally transformed since we've been stuck in the pandemic. We've seen a rise in online events. For the most part, we've seen success from those events. So often we see a greater reach in terms of the ability to have a bigger audience than you would necessarily do at an in-person event. And I think that the online events are here to stay for the foreseeable future anyway. It doesn't replace face-to-face interaction. It's much more difficult, obviously, to build relationships in a virtual setting. And I think that in the longer term, we probably envisage a hybrid situation with both online and in-person events. So we need to think about ways in which we can shape all those types of events and make them more inclusive. Think about the timing of the event, whether it's, you know, it's the same as giving people a choice in terms of what kind of marketing activity they want to do. The timing of a webinar isn't any different. You know, will you get greatest value from hosting an early morning session, a lunchtime session, an evening session, etc. But give people a choice, mix it up a bit. As I said earlier, it's never a case of one size fits all.
Yeah, it's interesting. Today I saw an advertisement come past from one of the solicitors firms that my chambers works with quite a bit, and I noticed that they were doing micro webinars, is what they're calling it now. So rather than the classic hour session, they were doing breakfast sessions for 20 minutes.
Bite size.
In bite size, exactly.
Yeah.
One of the other things I wanted to touch on, which is an interesting idea, and I think it's probably not done often enough. And you mentioned that as a junior barrister, you should be asking for feedback. And I think to me, that just seems applicable through your whole career trajectory, regardless of whether you're junior or a silk. But and I think what I took away from that was ask for feedback, keep track of the feedback that you get, and don't be afraid to ask for feedback. What's some of the feedback that you've received from solicitors in your role as a marketing director?
Yeah, interesting. There are a few things that I've consistently picked up over the years from solicitors about working with barristers. Not necessarily all of them they'd say to barristers directly, so I'm in a beneficial position. But I think overridingly, responsiveness is paramount. Solicitors think that counsel often don't understand the pressures they face from clients, particularly around responsiveness. So just because something doesn't appear urgent from a procedural perspective doesn't mean the solicitor won't have a client pressurizing them, asking for a draft yesterday. And sometimes it's for good reason, you know, that they may need board approval on it. So responsiveness is really, really key. Also being a team player with other counsel and also solicitors. So the solicitor's job is to make their client's in-house team look good to their management. Solicitors want counsel to do the same for them. Know who you're talking to and adjust accordingly. So I spoke to a partner at a firm who said that they were quite happy for counsel to lecture them on abstract points on derivatives, as it wasn't, you know, their area. But they said they were quite taken aback when a silk they hadn't worked with before started to explain to them the basic rules of full and frank disclosure, and said that it felt quite patronising. So it's always worth looking up solicitors online to have an idea of the level of experience and knowledge that they're likely to have. Other things I've heard from solicitors is to try and stick to agreed deadlines. If you don't think you'll make it for whatever reason, give the solicitor a heads up as soon as you can. The solicitors are accountable, and they're the ones who have to explain a missed deadline to the partners and clients. Also, be as approachable as possible. Solicitors need to be able to communicate with you, and often in stressful or time-pressured situations. So things may get missed if there's a reluctance to raise issues. If solicitors feel that they're able to pick up the phone to you on a more ad hoc basis, you're more likely to get work from them when they're instructed, as you'll already have that relationship. And equally, if you're working closely on a matter with the solicitor team, I've heard this so many times, share your direct dial or a mobile number with them so they don't have to go through a switchboard every time they want to talk to you. It's really important. Solicitors value so much having the confidence to be able to pick up the phone to counsel without much notice or on a more casual basis. I think making the associates look good to the partners goes a long way. I think I touched on that earlier. Just like the partners, you know, want the associates to make them look good to the clients. A simple but highly effective tip from solicitors is listen to what they want. Yeah, that's something that we should all be doing more of. I think, isn't it? Yeah. Now there's two things that you've mentioned or mentioned in all of the advice that you've given so far: directories and social media, and they're two things that I really dislike being involved with. I dread it as a barrister in terms of marketing. So let's tackle them now, shall we? Social media, let's take that one first. What's your advice to junior tenants? So anyone under 10 years call, is your advice the same depending on your level of seniority, and what is your advice? I think so. I think so. There are some basic rules. So lots of lawyers have discovered and become more invested in social media channels. It can help to build communications profile. It can serve as a good researching tool, and it's an easy way to grow your network and follow up with people that you've met. I don't know when the last time anyone here was handed a business card, but they're certainly not as commonplace as they once were. And linking in with contacts is now a more modern way to exchange details. LinkedIn, probably everybody who's listening is on LinkedIn, but it offers a free service. It's easy to use. So if you haven't got an account, you should certainly consider getting one. So when we're thinking about best practice when it comes to social media, I think first of all, and this is of vital importance, check if your set has a social media policy. And if they do, make sure that anything that you're doing is adhering to that policy. But regardless of that, you should apply some basic rules to your personal approach to social media, whether that be LinkedIn or Twitter. We don't tend to use Facebook so much on a professional level. Think about yourself as a brand that you're selling. Avoid anything politically charged. Again, it sounds really obvious, but don't post anything about a confidential matter. And even if it's not confidential, it's always a good idea to check your client is happy for you to refer to it in the public domain. Do like and share interesting posts and comment on items relating to your sector. You should really encourage positivity on social media. And perhaps try and get into the habit of checking LinkedIn once a day. Have a glance through your homepage for 10 minutes each morning, or on your commute, perhaps. The homepage on LinkedIn is a place to see what's going on in your network and share professional posts in your feed. And it's a great way to keep in touch with professional moves as well. Solicitors move around all the time, much more so than members of the bar. You should congratulate people where appropriate. You know, you never know, it may lead to a discussion about work. Just asking people what they've been up to, people appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is we need to be spending a little bit more time, at least once a day is your best practice. With
Yeah, just being mindful of it. It's a good knowledge hub.
Yeah. And then the other dreaded subject is directories. So for junior tenants, how important are they?
Well, I'm just going to touch on directories, Jessica, because frankly, there's enough to fill a whole other webinar on that. Talking about the benefits of a ranking, I'm sure everybody knows this, but directories are used by instructing solicitors to find counsel, and a listing in the directories is external verification. So it's an avenue to promote yourself and to show that you're a recommended person in your field. The main directories are Chambers and Partners in the Legal 500, and to a lesser extent, Who's Who Legal. The rankings are broken down by areas of practice, and each year sets of chambers have an opportunity to put members forward for inclusion in the rankings as part of the directory submission season. Anyone can submit, but the general rule of thumb is that you won't be considered in the main rankings until you're at least 7 or 8 years cool. There is separately an up and coming section for juniors of 10 years cool and under. I think from a marketing perspective, we have to be fairly discerning about who submits in chambers. If you haven't got quite the right amount of cases in any given area, or they're not considered to be strong enough cases to submit, it's actually best to wait until you can make a strong entry. Otherwise, including weaker entries could potentially be damaging to chambers' overall submission in that area. So again, this process is all about profile. So business development initiatives and activities you undertake in the years leading up to you making a submission will mean that the market's aware of you and you're hopefully being talked about, which is the very first step in obtaining a ranking anyway. The researchers rely very heavily on referee feedback, more so in some cases than the submission itself. So it's really crucial. And most of their research is conducted through emails and phone calls. They like to obtain feedback from solicitors mainly, obviously, but worth considering that feedback from peers and opponents also carries a lot of weight with the directories. Researchers speak to barristers from a wide range of sets, so it's important to consider that. Remember also to put people down who can speak about your skills with confidence and in detail, and obviously people are going to say nice things about you. With Chambers and Partners, you should put forward 5 different referees if possible, so no more than 5 for Chambers and Partners. They won't contact any more than that, but you can include more for the Legal 500. And in your submission, use the best examples of your cases. This is the area I think the directories describe as your work highlights. And in that, make sure you're summarising the matters that you're including in your submission, your role in the matter, its significance, whether it's because of a change in the law, a high-profile client, or a significant value. It's almost as though, you have to think of it as you're writing to somebody who doesn't have any knowledge of the law in the area that they're researching. So you have to make it as simple as possible for the researcher to understand and really break it down in those terms. Sets of chambers also have the opportunity to recommend people for various awards in various categories, such as Junior of the Year. So think carefully about if any of the work you've undertaken may put you in a position to be considered for one of these awards, and always consult your clerks about the prospect of that. And I think the last thing I was going to say was, if you've made a submission previously, or you've been making submissions for a couple of years and you've not yet been included in the guide, in the rankings, don't be disheartened by that. It takes time to build up your profile with the directories, and it's really a case of having to persist with them. The more your name comes up during the course of the research over the years, the more that they'll start to listen. And there is a sense of having to play the game a little bit with the directories.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that's probably one of the more disheartening experiences that you can have when you've reached a particular threshold as a junior barrister, and you think, oh, I'm going to try and go for these directories, and then you realize that it's a whole, it's a whole separate game that you weren't even really exposed to in your first couple of years.
And to an extent, it's a numbers game as well. In some of the areas, some of the categories that are really saturated, that, you know, so many people want to be in, such as commercial litigation. There's so many people in there, and people, you know, that they say to me, "Oh, I've been trying for years to get in." Unfortunately, it is a bit of a numbers game in some instances, and sometimes, you know, it's worth just having a review of your submissions with your clerks or marketing team, because in some respects they'll be able to pull a few strings and really push you if you've got the cases that, you know, that should be that make it the position that you should be included.
Yeah, and it sounds also like, from what you've said, that in terms of your submissions to either Legal 500, but particularly I think chambers and partners, because that's quite limited, that there's almost like a language that you need to understand and possess in order to have the researchers understand how important the cases are that you've put down and why you are an
and
expert
making it as simple as possible. Exactly. Yeah,
great. Well, that is all incredibly helpful information. Certainly stuff that I wish I'd gotten to know when I was a bit younger in my career trajectory. But in the meantime, before we move on, let me just check if there are any questions that we've got. It doesn't look like we've got any. We've got some great feedback on the Q&A box. And it looks like, in terms of the chat box, that Sam Profit, who's a former solicitor but now a barrister, he echoed some of the feedback that you were giving in terms of how solicitors, the feedback that solicitors have given in terms of working with barristers. And I think it really does come back to bedside manner, doesn't it, Petra?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I think I hope I expressed it in a polite manner. It's not always as polite when I've been having a solicitor or but I think it's really important for counsel to know, for barristers to understand how solicitors feel, and it's not always a conversation that naturally takes place. You know, certainly when you're under pressure and you're working on a particular matter. So it's, you know, I'm like the middleman, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's that point about understanding how the solicitor's life looks like during the life of this high pressure case that you're running together, I think is a really important one, because the few instances where I've seen moments with seniors interacting with solicitors, or even with clients, where I thought, oh, that's a bit interesting. Have been moments because they just didn't recognize or understand fully in that moment what the solicitor was grappling with, and how much pressure they were under, and what their needs are in those instances, and what they want from the situation. So it really does come back to listening, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure it's something that's necessarily, you know, people are necessarily told to look out for. Certainly not at, you know, during in the training they undertake on the way to being a barrister. So, you know, all of this is sort of additional information, which might be quite a lot to take on. And as I said at the beginning, you know, everybody's busy trying to run a practice, trying to establish a practice. So it's not, none of this is particularly easy, but hopefully it's provided a little bit of insight, and people can use it.
Now, we've had a question about the BD plan that you keep referring to. And one of the questions is, can you please elaborate on what form a barrister BD plan usually takes? Now, I can answer from my perspective, which is I use both an Excel spreadsheet and a Word document. I think my BD plan is probably slightly more, what's the word I'm looking for? Qualitative than what Petra, you've been advocating, which is that I treat it more like a business plan. So I have one for my year ahead, and then I have one for about 5 years. That one is a bit more fuzzy, but it's kind of like the idea of like, where would I like to see myself in 5 years' time? And then the Excel spreadsheet is for keeping track of seminars, webinars that I've given, things that I've authored on various blogs, and then solicitor contacts as well. Petra, what does your BD plan look like?
I mean, very similar to that, Jessica, definitely. I touched on before things to potentially include, and that was solicitor contacts, as we said, the number of seminars, webinars that you're giving, the number of articles you want to, you know, set yourself to write targets, to set yourself to write a certain number of articles, attending events and conferences, make a record of how many of those that you've been to, whether that's something you've done on your own or something you've done as a part of a chamber's business development activity. Just keep a record of all of it.
Yeah.
Lunches, dinners, coffees, you know, follow-ups, any client contact really, even in terms of emails that you've sent. And you know, you could also keep a record or you know, make a plan in terms of your earnings. So it's completely up to you. It may be that your set has some sort of pro forma that you can use, but ultimately it's really just about keeping a record that will act as a checklist for you on a personal basis.
Yeah, and there's two things I'd like to add to that, actually. The thinking about the experience in my chambers. So we regularly get a printout from our clerks in terms of who we've done work for, at the top, you know, how much these particular firms have paid us in particular sectors as well. And what that emphasizes to me is that you should really be speaking frequently with your clerks about solicitor contacts that you have, about and getting the breakdown in terms of what the allocation of work has been for you. If you're in a chambers like mine, where we have a really broad sets of work that you can do, ranging from clinical negligence, personal injury, all the way to banking and financial, you know, there's a lot of ground that you can cover in a couple of months, and it's important to get a printout or a breakdown from your clerks in terms of who's giving you work in what areas, because the numbers are often quite different from what you think in your mind. Oh, this past week I've done this much work for this person. It sometimes doesn't equate in the same way. So that's advice I would give. The other thing that I would say as well to junior tenants, or those even just starting out in their first year or two in tenancy, is have an idea of where you want your career to go, both in terms of what kind of areas of law you want to practice in, but also if you're interested in, for instance, pursuing a career at the High Court or becoming a judge or wanting to take silk. And I say that not because it's something that you need to start thinking about immediately, but it's because it helps guide your processes to what your motivation is for making the choices for the kind of work that you're going to accept later down the line. So I know, for instance, in my chambers, I certainly had a policy, because we do so much, a variety of work. I had a policy in my first, I'd say 3 years of practice, that I would try anything once. You know, I'd go to the winders, but I'd also do a clin neg trial because I saw advantages in doing that kind of work. But after those 3 years, it became important for me to really just like evaluate all those experiences and say, look, time is a finite resource. Where do I want to go with my career, and what areas am I going to need to drop, and what areas am I going to need to take more seriously in order to get me there? So I see that as well as part of this BD plan that you're talking about. And that's what I call kind of like the 5-year plan in a way.
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, you know, it can be anything, but it's a good idea to make some short-term and some more medium and long-term plans and set some objectives there.
Yeah. Another question related to this is we've been asked whether it's worth investing in something like Salesforce.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say yes, you definitely should. I don't think it's particularly necessary. If you find that would help you personally, then yes, of course. But I think, you know, having a combination of a Word document and a spreadsheet, if you like working within those, is more than sufficient. I don't think there needs to be anything particularly sophisticated. It is literally just a case of making notes, keeping a plan, and having a checklist.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the times that I've used Salesforce in my previous careers, it's not something that I'd ever thought, oh yes, this is what I'm missing now
No, exactly.
from
Yeah.
my events here. And it's quite clunky. Whereas really what you're suggesting is a couple of emails here and there
It's
across
fairly
the month.
basic stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. And a daily check-in on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Another question that we've received, and I'll just read it out because I think it is an important one, is you mentioned, Petra, building relationships outside Chamber's own BD activities. What would be your best advice for approaching solicitors as a junior member starting out who might not have as many organic opportunities to build relationships as more senior barristers?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and a very good point. And I think the best way to do that is to attend as many Chambers events as you possibly can and get involved. I think I mentioned forward planning. You know, ask your clerks, ask your marketing team what's going on. Is it in your you know, the central diary system that your Chambers uses? Ask them to put those events in your diary so you know when they're happening and you can attend if possible. Join as many webinars as you can, go to as many seminars as you can, get involved in the specialist bar events. You know, just put yourself out there as much as possible. You will make connections doing that, and you will be able to then follow on with those connections. And I think that that's just the best way, is doing as much as possible.
Yeah, and I would say as well, in addition to just attending those seminars or webinars, if there is something that you think that you can speak about, pitch that idea to both your Chamber's marketing director and your clerks and say, look, I think there's either this recent case that has come out, or I've noticed that this latest pilot that's been used by the court service is bringing up some issues. It can be as boring as that.
Absolutely.
But because solicitors need to know about these pilot schemes, for instance, I know that there's recently been a lot of news about the business and property courts and that pilot scheme. That if you suggest doing a webinar on that kind of topic, for instance, or anything else that might come across an interesting case that you've seen on Lawtel, something that you yourself have been working on as a junior or on a big case, or in your own capacity running your own cases, just pitch webinar ideas and seminar ideas, and that will give you an audience as well. And it will also,
yeah, and I think you'll find in most sets, clerks and marketing teams are crying out for suggestions for content. So yeah, don't be afraid to speak up. And exactly right, Jessica, that's another way to get your name out there, raise your profile.
Yeah. Now we're coming up to almost the end here. So I will leave the Q&A box open for just a few more moments for anyone to ask some burning questions. But in the meantime, what I'd like to ask you, Petra, is what would you say are the key takeaways that you would want? What do you say are the key takeaways from everything you've said today?
Okay, things to take away. I think number one, don't just drift along. Don't assume that, you know, things will happen on your behalf through Chambers. You have to make plans to further your own personal business development and try to stick to those plans as much as is possible. Be as active as possible, be as visible as possible. Have self-confidence. For lots of people, it's not at all easy to blow your own trumpet, for want of a better word, but it is important that you put yourself out there as much as possible, and believe that the connections you're making and relationships you're building will pay dividends in the long run. So, you know, make yourself known, get out there, get involved in Chambers initiatives is one to take away. Always be positive when you're talking about Chambers, other members of your Chambers, and also peers at other sets. You never know when your presence amongst peers may have an indirect impact on how others regard you. The Bar Council also offers various forms of written guidance for the young bar, including some advice on building and managing your practice. It's all available on their website, and there's also some guidance there on growing your international practice, which is probably worth a look. But I'd say that those are the sort of main things to take away from today.
Yeah, so I guess the key thing is be active, be positive, and keep listening and keep doing.
Be visible, absolutely.
Great. Well, unless there's any last minute burning questions, I think that will conclude our webinar today. So firstly, I'd like to thank everyone, all 43 attendees for taking time out of their day and to attend. Oh, wait, what? Oh, that's a thank you. You're very welcome. Thank you everybody for attending. And Petra, thank you so much for taking the time to make this webinar possible and for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been lovely to chat to you, Jessica. Thanks everyone for attending.
And finally, one last thing for me to say is that this webinar will be available on the Gray's Inn YouTube page, probably in about a week or so. So in case anyone you know who wasn't able to make it today still wants the benefit of Petra's wisdom and her advice as to BD plans and targets, please urge them to go to the Gray's Inn website and the YouTube channel, where they can hear all of the excellent information that we've received today. Yeah, and other than that, thank you everybody. Thank you, Petra.
Thank you,
and have a good evening.
Yeah.